Hello and welcome to the Change by Design podcast, where we take a look at all things engineering transformation. Got some really great topics to dive into this week. I'm Josh Corman, head of content at Lifecycle Insights, joined once again by Chad Jackson, our CEO and chief analyst. Chad, last week we started off talking about allergy season and springtime, and today we're both prepping for, I think, kind of a winter apocalypse. And so, we've swung the other
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think, it's interesting. I wouldn't mind getting a bunch of snow all at once. I think that could kind of be fun for a little while. But I think here in Austin, Texas, we're going to go above and below the freezing point. So hopefully we don't get a whole lot of ice on the road. That's the big concern that we have here in Texas and on the trees and power lines and that kind of thing. So I think you're going to get more of it, or you're getting more of it, I should say.
Yeah, a little bit further north, again, like you, I think hoping to avoid the ice. That's where the real snarls can come into play. But yeah, we went from springtime allergy discussions to it's hard to imagine anything blooming in the weather that's going on outside. So might not have to worry about that for a while. But like I said at the top, we've got some non-snow related topics on the engineering side of things to discuss. And you know I think the thing that's at the top of our list, we've talked about AI a lot, right? I made the joke, I think, last week that we might not get through an entire podcast recording this year. Who knows for how long without mentioning AI because it's ever present. But I know that you participated in a conversation. We're kind of keeping your eye on a discussion around this, right? And we've talked a lot about how can you integrate AI into engineering and design workflows, and is there really the capacity for that right now? Where does that stuff stand? And I know that you were involved in kind of taking a look at the discussion with somebody who had sort of put out, here's how that might look, right? And here's how AI native engineering workflows could kind of come around. So talk a little bit about what that conversation was around and kind of what you took away from it.
Yeah. Yeah. It was fascinating and pretty brilliant. So the author of the post is Benedict Smith. Has experience in the PLM industry and with PLM solutions. And he's been exploring, okay, how do you make AI functional? Like, how do you really make it? How do you circumvent a lot of the problems that we're running into right now? And one of those problems is, I would just describe it best as like buffering. So when you have a progressive thread with AI where you go back and forth, it only remembers so much. So if the thread is very, very long, there's stuff at the beginning that it no longer remembers, and it
Mhm.
will come back and say the same thing to you again and again and again. So in that way, it's a little bit like, talking with someone with ADD or maybe a memory issue where they can't remember what you said, 5 prompts ago. So to address that, he's been exploring this concept of AI scaffolding. And the idea there is that you use AI and you collectively, you build up a document that acts as an input for the AI prompt. And because of the buffer problem, you start a session with an AI, you only go 2 or 3 prompts and then you end it. That session is ended, but everything that was there was documented in this document that is the input to the next interaction or session with the AI. And you do this progressively, and you end the session with the AI at some frequency,
Mhm.
but everything's documented in that document or spreadsheet or whatever you're going to use. And that way it always has the full context, because when you start a new session, it reads the whole document and says, okay, these are the constraints. This is the background information, and it can hold that. So I thought it was fascinating. Um, it's a fascinating approach to address an issue that we're experiencing with AI today and a way to make it more productive. So that's the top level view.
Yeah, that's really interesting because something you and I have talked about on here before is the challenge when it comes to, design and development or integrating AI into, engineering processes you don't have, people talk a lot about, where does the model get all of its foundational information and what are those inputs? If it is answering questions about a given topic, at some point it had to ingest those answers
Hmm.
and at least be able to piece together enough to provide a response. And this sounds like it's an attempt to provide that foundation by giving it engineering decision data and kind of building your own foundation, maybe just, internally, right? Because we've
Hmm.
talked about leaving
Yeah.
data out, exposed, so to speak, or information that companies
Hmm.
might not be super thrilled about handing over to, an LLM or something similar. So this sounds like a way of kind of addressing that core issue that we've run into on the engineering side of things and giving it some of that good input, that good kind of foundational
Yeah.
information that you can use to build on top of it and kind of cutting those conversations off. And, like you said, predetermined frequencies as a way of protecting against some of, like you said, the kind of, just functional limitations that we're finding with some of these models.
Yeah, exactly. You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly right. And I think that, it's going to be really interesting. I think, number one, I think this method could work. It can make things more productive right now, but there's going to have to be a culture shift in some engineering domains. Like, for example, system engineers can be fairly disciplined around, okay, let's get this stuff in the model. Because if it's not in the model, then you can't do traceability, you can't do a flow down from RFLP. Mhm. So I think that could work well with systems engineers. Hmm. With mechanical engineers, it might, there might be challenges. And we've talked about this before, where a mechanical engineer sees the space that their design needs to go into, right? A bracket, a motor, whatever it's going to be. They do a lot of that processing around constraints and context in their head. It never gets documented anywhere. And then they go into CAD and start creating 3D geometry. So they jump from no documentation or very, very little documentation to, I'm developing the physical implementation of the solution.
Mhm.
So I think for a system engineer that might be very disciplined, this method could work really well. For a mechanical engineer that's used to, skipping steps, or as I like to say, show your work for calculus.
Yeah.
Um, it's a big change, and I think that could be an impediment or a barrier to adopting this approach.
Yeah, and it gets to something else we talk about a lot, value and risk, right? And those two
Hmm.
different situations are maybe a good illustration of, you make an evaluation and one group might be a little bit more well suited to implement a tactic like this because existing, processes and their sort of existing way of working, it doesn't feel, like you said, if you're used to putting everything in a model and needing that representation, changing the workflow a little bit, but still following that same principle might be easier. Whereas, yeah, I'm not sure, and I don't know if, as a,
Yeah.
somebody who's mechanical engineer by trade, is there a way to get those internal, processes and calculations out and represented? It feels almost like a generational shift. I think about people who are streamers and they just sort of get used to like narrating their entire lives out loud and putting that, out into the world. It almost feels like you would need someone sort of talking their way through their thought process, as that input to maybe build some of that AI foundation. I'm not sure how practical that is, but that does, it's clear when you describe that why that represents a challenge and why the value for mechanical engineers maybe requires a little bit more thinking to get to that point where it could be something that would be easily integratable, or at least, integratable without a massive amount of disruption to existing, protocols.
So, Josh, you just triggered an image in my head of something I had talked about a long time ago. But this is going to be a callback. Think back to the first Iron Man movie,
Done.
and the design process that Tony Stark used with Jarvis. He was talking to it
Yeah.
out loud stream of consciousness almost, right? But interacting through a voice
Hmm.
prompt. And, eventually maybe that's what the solution looks like for mechanical engineers, which is very different from, fundamentally systems engineering is built on a code language,
Hmm.
SysML, and that's a lot more like vibe coding, where you're going back and forth building code up with an AI assistant. So there might be different modes here. And the Iron Man movie came out. When was that? Was that early 2000s or was it
So I
late
think
2000s?
2008 was the first. Yeah, that's the start of the MCU. The
Yes.
year that the smartphone, the iPhone launched, right, in kind of widespread way. But it's funny you use that as the example of how that might work, because as someone, if you're outside the world of engineering, I think that idea that like so much of this work happens inside people's heads, it both makes sense and feels kind of scary, because you're like,
Yeah.
wow, there is so much there that is not potentially represented, and the how, right, of getting what is internal into some sort of form that can be ingested or used as a way to guide future processes and kind of try to stabilize
Yeah.
those things and make them more predictable. It makes
Yeah.
sense, but I think your point about it requiring a shift to be implemented maybe in kind of the mechanical engineering world, that shift needing to be a little bit greater, that way of thinking, and it sounds like that will be a competitive advantage. Perhaps you get to the point where AI
Yeah.
integrated and AI native workflows are more the norm. We discussed that last week. When that exactly is coming and how, we don't know, but it sounds like there's a huge advantage out there for the company that can kind of get to that point and maybe solve
Yeah.
that problem of taking the purely internal and making it something that can be read and responded to.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think I think there's some real potential for it. I think this scaffolding, we got deep into a tactic and it talks about,
Sure.
addresses a flaw of AI. But I think if we kind of elevate the conversation, this does get into the interaction mode, and it probably
Mhm.
does need to look different for different people, um, and different generations. Like you said, kind of like that stream of consciousness for the youngest generations. They're more used to it, um, unless you want to, stick a chip in someone's head and have it process thoughts without talking. But yeah, maybe that's a little too crazy. But anyway, the overall point here is that you're going to need different modes of interaction and user experience as these things get more mature.
Yeah, and that interactive description you have of kind of working with, I think there maybe, I don't know, my layperson's vision would be like, well, hopefully you get to a point where you press button, design created, right? You get this sort of, but I don't know that that is actually, the way you're talking, it's like I think there's maybe more security, more peace of mind, and the idea of scaffolding, and I come from an education background, is really rooted in there as well, trying to build supports for tools and the people using them in place, because students learn at different paces. They learn most effectively in different ways. So there is some of that, those principles, I think, that can be, kind of applied in the same way. And that idea of it not as a solution that takes the place of engineering actions, but that works in concert with the human side of that and goes back and forth.
Yeah.
It feels both closer to reality, right? Like where we are now, but also maybe something that actually would be better from an outcome perspective of having that check and balance in place from the engineers who have been doing something a certain way for a very long
Uh,
time, and usually pretty effective.
and also, I think it's a good half measure step towards agentic AI, right? The idea that AI is going to operate independently and autonomously of you, making
Mhm.
choices and decisions. I think this is that interaction mode, and using scaffolding is still a human
Mhm.
layer involved in driving decisions. So, um, I think that is a good half step or half measure. So, yes.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, and we can include the link to the original post, that you mentioned. Is Benedict Smith? Is that right?
Yeah.
The author of that. So people can check that out and check out the conversation that was going on around, AI native workflows and the scaffolding we just discussed. So yeah, we'll put that link in the show notes so people can check that out. And we'll transition kind of right to research. I know that we've got, as always, a little bit of research on our agenda, but I'll swip. That's not a word. I'll swap the order of the topics just a little bit, because we've just been talking about AI. And I know that something that we've discussed on recent episodes is really wanting to be community driven and community led in, not just the content that we put out, but also hearing from people about what is interesting and valuable on the research side of things. And we asked that question, what out there is sort of most pressing as to our tribe, I think, as you described them last week. And we learned a little bit about where people's focus is pointed, and it may be connected to what we were just discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. So are you talking about the resistance thing or the systems engineering thing?
Well, talking about AI in engineering in general, right? Because we kind of wanted to know, what is it that you want us to go out there and dig into, right? And we learned that there is a pretty sizable amount of interest in that topic, much to our relief, because like I said, we're going to mention it all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, we ran a LinkedIn survey, and I think we got 25 responses. It is very small.
Sure.
However, it was really interesting what the answer was. I think we had 4 answers in there. I think we had Agile for hardware, AI for engineering, resistance to change, and other. Please specify in the comments. And AI and engineering came out at 48%. So, obviously this is a topic of extreme interest. And we're seeing that in other research as well. But actually, so I think this is going to be a theme throughout the year. It's going to manifest in all sorts of different ways. And yes, I think we will be talking about this pretty much every week. But the thing that also caught my eye is resistance to change was number 2 at 36%. And I think that shows, and we actually saw this in our bigger, broader study where we collected 300 respondents.
Yeah.
And the people side of change was the biggest barrier or challenge in terms of change initiatives. This kind of reinforced that, and I thought that was very interesting. It's good to hear these types of topics from different angles. It helps us triangulate and verify and validate that, okay, yeah, this is a thing. This is an important thing, right? So resistance came out pretty high. And if you're competing, like if, you're talking about 12-point difference between AI and engineering and resistance to change, I think one is a very high profile topic, AI and engineering. It's got everybody's mind share. But the fact that like this simple, long-standing issue, we've been talking about resistance to change for decades. And the fact that that's competing with this hot, fresh, like in your face all the time type of topic, AI, specific to engineering in this case, but that just shows you how long and the staying power of that issue and how unsolved it is, frankly. So yeah, a lot of people are definitely still struggling with that.
Yeah, it's interesting, those two things feel connected, because my guess is when, we see this in other areas, in Hollywood, for example, right? Hundreds of people signing petitions, keep AI out of movie production, don't use it to do effect. There's this real fear, right, around, is this going to take my job? Is it going to make me redundant? And we've talked about some of how change in general, right, can inspire those and spark those kinds of fears and that uncertainty in the people, the practitioners on the end of it, right, who are being asked to change the way that they work. And so it feels like no matter what the change is, right, whether it is AI coming down the pipe and we're going to have to figure out how this applies and how best to use it, right, how to get value out of it while minimizing our risk. And no matter what that is, though, there is this anticipation and this prevalence of, we know it's going to meet some kind of resistance. Like you said in our bigger study that we just did, we learned that, right? We talked previously about organizations being good at achieving their goals related to change initiatives, but still experiencing a lot of resistance along the way, right? And having to navigate that and how much less efficient it might make that process. And so it feels like people are never, you're right, it's not the sexier of the two topics, right? AI versus just resistance to change. But I think it does speak to this sort of ever presence of that resistance and that understanding that no matter what shift we make, we are going to have to deal with some amount of pushback, right, from the people who are taking that on. And we've learned a lot about, I think, how to manage that, how that can actually be valuable. And we've talked about resistance as feedback. But you're right, those two topics, I think no matter what the shift is, people understand that if they cannot execute efficiently on the changes and they get bogged down by the resistance and it leads to workarounds or delays, then, the technology, the goals that you're trying, all of that stuff sort of has to take a back seat to managing the people side of that, which we've also discussed, right? And so resistance being there is not, it's not shocking, but I do think it speaks to no matter what the topic of the moment is, that from a leadership perspective, there really is a heightened awareness that somebody somewhere is going to have an issue with this. And how do you deal with that becomes, I think, kind of the linchpin in maximizing your success levels and minimizing the inefficiency that you get from resistance along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you and I have talked a little bit about this, and I want to share it with the listeners and viewers. And it's about attitudes and assumptions towards change. So in this, mini poll that we did on LinkedIn and then the broader study that we just conducted here recently, and we're going to publish, reports on this soon. My attitude, I think your attitude too, going into this is that you want to achieve benefits from your change initiative, and resistance is bad. Like, you want to minimize it, right? You want to deal with it, get it out of the way, and then get on to the good stuff of the change initiative.
Right.
I think, I certainly have learned a lot that's not the healthy way to approach it. And what I mean by that, there are certainly activities that you can do, and this is actually part of what we're analyzing right now, and we're going to publish in the report, that can help reduce resistance. However, I think it's important to fundamentally change your attitude about resistance. And there's two kind of pivot points there. One is, it's going to happen. Fundamentally, a change initiative is about change, and no one really likes change. No one really wants to change the way that they've been doing things, because that's really hard. It means you're going to be slower. It means that you need new skills. It can be threatening, all these things. There's going to be resistance, period. So coming to that realization that if I do anything at all, there's going to be resistance. But number two, flipping your attitude from this is a terrible thing, resistance, to good grief, this is an amazing opportunity, right? This is an opportunity to meet people where they are, to actually try to listen to them, get feedback, and help them help you, help me help you, kind of reduce disruption. Like, this little piece of your change initiative, it would completely trash, my week every week. I'm going to be working twice as much. I'm going to be getting half as much stuff done. So it's an opportunity to listen and improve your change initiative. But number three, it's an incredible opportunity to increase investment. So if you can get them and engage those people to say, not just, hey, how do we tweak this thing? But, hey, why don't you come help us figure out the best way to do this? You're smart. You're doing this every day, a piece of this process or practice or methodology. What do you think is going to work? What would improve it, right? So if you can get them to contribute they become invested in the success of the change initiative. So I think attitudes about resistance, it's not just feedback. We had that famous quote that
Mhm.
we use a lot here from Sarah Junio, a great, insightful person looking at organizational change management and resistance. But not is it only just feedback, it's an opportunity to engage and increase investment. And I've gotten some religion around this, some passion because it's so important.
Right.
This is it. We've seen from the findings, the people side of change is the biggest problem. I talked with a CTO of a business unit in the aerospace and defense company. They have on the order of 10,000 engineers. And we talked about this balance of how much of it is a technology problem, how much it is a people problem. He said it's 80-20.
Mhm.
It's 80% people, 20% technology. So again, resistance, it's going to happen. It's a way to engage and improve what you're doing, but also increase investment and participation and contribution.
Yeah, I think when we talked offline about it recently, you used a phrase that immediately made sense to me and that I'm going to expose now. The judo throw of resistance, right? If you don't know
Yeah.
anything about judo, there's you see the idea of the little, fighter and the big fighter and the little guy using the weight of the opponent against them. And that is the principle, right, of judo, of knowing your balance and your position. And when you describe this to me, it sounds like, look, there's a threat right across the ring from you. It's this large threat called resistance. And if you just brace yourself and grit your teeth, you might get run over by it, right? But if you're prepared and you can
Hmm.
anticipate that shift and you can then use the weight of the resistance, right, which can cause disruption. If everybody is just heels dug in against this and thinks it's a bad idea, but there's no opportunity to communicate that, to be heard, to build trust. I think that's another thing, in the research we discovered, we asked people qualitatively, right, what is your experience with some of this stuff? And we heard a lot of, this is an opportunity, like you said, not just to hear, not just to get the feedback, but to build the trust and to build this idea of transparent communications by actually engaging in those moments with the concerns that you're hearing. And then, like you said, using them in the stream of the process to make improvements to what you're doing well before you get to the end of the road. It's so funny to me as a layperson how this overlaps with what we discussed, like Agile for hardware. Build frequent prototypes, learn fast, understand early what your problems might be so that you're not running into them at the end of validation process where they can cause even bigger headaches. I think there's a very similar kind of logic at play here. And you're right, we've seen, and I've been working on that report, and it's exactly right. There's a high correlation for not just success but outstanding levels of success, right? You achieved your
Sure.
goals and you actually found value that maybe you didn't even expect beyond those goals, and the correlation there to having these open feedback and listening sessions and making this sort of, making that preparation and making that engagement really explicit and getting it out in the open. And like you said, elevating and discovering potential flaws that you might not have seen because the practitioners are in a position to speak to what will wreck their whole weeks, for example, or get
Yeah.
into that kind of disruption. And so all of that is really fascinating. But I do think you're right. Your first point about the the flip of your attitude, right? Don't assume that, well, people have got their heels dug in, this is going to mean failure or it's going to mean, pain for us. Embracing that, executing the judo throw of resistance can really make a huge difference. So I'm eager for that to, for those findings to kind of be put out in that format because it is an opportunity for us, I think, to find a piece of nuance in a conversation that, I'm sure most executives are like, well, if I can avoid resistance, please, let's go that path. And we kind of learned that, like, you can't really, like you can't avoid all resistance. You're going to run into some of it. So have your eyes open, know what you're getting into, and then it actually works for you.
Yeah. And you know what's really interesting about this? The the place that this line of thinking, these conclusions lead you to is really interesting. So if you need to flip from, okay, resistance is something to just be overcome, flipping to resistance is an opportunity, right? On many, many different fronts, it leads you to a place of, well, what's the skill set of the people leading this initiative look like now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you need to engage people, if you need to understand their concerns, if you need to get them to participate, if you need to draw them in, there's a whole set of emotional intelligence and soft skills that you need to be successful. So the profile of that change agent needs to be different, right? It needs to not just be, here's the technological solution, here's the IT stuff. Here is a whole bunch of broadcast communications to let people know what we're talking about and to drive alignment with vision. You need another set of skills to engage and listen and also be comfortable in some cases with confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different when you look at the profile of a modern and successful change agent. And you don't see a lot of that training out there today. So,
yeah, those feedback and listening sessions and that intentional cultivation of resistance and feedback on that front, it does, you're right, inform you of what the path of your particular change initiative and the struggles you might face as an organization. That's where you're going to get the kind of detailed information that can give you what you need to, like you said, plan for what those roles need to have in their toolbox and maybe the processes that you then go through with different groups to address, that feedback. And it stands to reason that in different industries, different kinds of organizations, complexity of product, all these things could shift that a little bit and make the specific kinds of challenges and feedback that you're going to get a little bit different. But knowing that that's coming and like you said, kind of being aware of how you can then flow that down to the people who are in charge of managing the change itself, you put yourself in a position to be more successful and really, like, it's again not eliminating the resistance, but it's just using it as efficiently as possible so that you don't have big long-term delays in your change initiatives, or they don't bleed into and pull resources from other programs and projects that you're currently leading that you can't just put aside. So, like I said, eager to get the report out, but I do think you're right that it can help people maybe reframe their thinking and their processes around some of this stuff in a way that becomes hopefully foundational, in every change initiative. Okay, we know that if we do these things, then we can really make good use of people like me who were the pesky people when a change initiative got introduced somewhere. And it's like, here are the 9 reasons why that will not work, and I'm sure that people, sure that the leadership in the school where I was teaching, for example, or whatever organization I was working with, probably thought, well, one, I knew this was coming, and 2, now I'm rolling my eyes because I have to deal with Josh's resistance, right? But I do think that really was maybe I'm just going to cast that as my attempt to be a very helpful soldier in the organization and point out all of the things that we needed to address. I was just trying to be helpful. It wasn't contrarianism or anything like
that's
that.
human
So,
nature.
yeah. Sure. But I do think it makes sense. And I think our findings are going to be interesting to people and hopefully give them, like I said, a path to doing things a little bit differently if they find that, man, we do get bogged down and we do find that we're having to coach people through, using some of these processes and not running end arounds to try to do it their own way because they don't feel supported in what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Dead on.
All right. So we've talked about recent research and stuff that we've got coming out. We also, you mentioned the resource library being a part of InsightEX, the platform that we're building to try to help out a lot of the folks that we're talking about, right? Make better decisions around, some of these big questions around change and the initiatives that they're leading. But we also have in this resource library a whole host of stuff that, as you've mentioned before, this is not a game that you're new to. We've been in the engineering world, been conducting research and creating publications around that for a long time. And we've set aside a lot of those that have some value, hopefully, that people can dig into in our resource library. So talk a little bit about what we've got there and what people can expect to find if they kind of go digging through past publications from Lifecycle Insights.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, going forward, we're going to be contributing a lot of content. It's so funny. Josh and I had these conversations, viewer, listener, around like, we don't have enough places to put this stuff. Like the paintings, all the reports, all the posts that we can generate now. So we're going to curate that, right? We're going to try to distill that down because we know change agents don't have a lot of time, right? So going forward, we're going to be contributing very frequently, 2 podcasts a week, is an example of that. It's going to be fresh. It's going to be timely, especially in the midst of fast changing parts of the industry like AI, right? In 3 months, it's going to look very, very different, right? So we're doing that going forward. However, we have been doing this since 2010. And over the course of that time, we have published over 200 things, ebooks, reports. We've done a lot of studies in the past. We surveyed over 20,000 engineers and their organizations. So there's a lot of value in those past ebooks and reports. And sometimes it's even to look back and say, boy, look how wrong that was. Don't do that. So what we're doing is we're adding those to the library over time. Initially we're doing about 30 from 2024 and 2025. Those are going in the library now. We're kind of setting it up so you can easily navigate through those, take a look at those. But we will be going backwards in time as we progress, right? So going to 2023, 2022, and on and on and on. And, as we get back to the mid, 20 teens, 2014, 2015, 2016, we were doing a lot of research, a lot of publishing around MBD, model-based definitions, and model-based enterprise. So some of that still stands, as good practice. Some of it does not. And that's why we're doing new research. And I think something we're going to be doing in the community, we have the discussion forum that you get access to if you don't work for a software provider, you don't work for a consulting firm, but you're a practitioner. You're working for a manufacturer looking at implementing these change initiatives. So what we're going to be doing is initiate discussions of, okay, back in 2018, we said these things about, shift left electronics design. How much of that still holds true? What's proven out to be valuable? What's proven out not to be valuable? Let's get a refresh of this thing based on what collectively we as a community, as a tribe, are experiencing. And I think that is going to be, that's part of the thing I'm so excited about the platform with. It's not just us broadcasting our stuff. I think we have good perspectives. We get exposed to a lot. We're conducting research. But to have these discussions around, okay, does this thing really hold true anymore? All of you out there in practice, actually trying to implement these changes, what do you think? Here's your opportunity to weigh in, to prove it or disprove it, or maybe there's nuance. Maybe there are circumstances it works and other circumstances it doesn't. So there's going to be a lot of value add on top of what we contribute through this platform. And I am super excited about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even what we talked about earlier, right, on a very small scale, having a LinkedIn poll where you get to ask folks following you on LinkedIn about, hey, what's the most interesting research direction or what feels like it's the most pressing concern? Even that little amount of feedback is such a helpful input for us to think about, what are our positions and what are we learning in research, but also how does that stack up to, the specific experiences of people across a range of industries, right? We know that there's going to be variation with that. And so I think you're exactly right. We, kind of envision this as taking the effect of something like a LinkedIn poll and blowing it up, right? Because it becomes not just bigger in number, right? It's not just asking more than the handful of people, but it's getting that qualitative response and feedback from people about their experience and about, how some of what we're putting out there shows up in the real world and in their, work experience. I think that is, is going to be, it's almost like the perpetual motion machine. If we can get that started and get people involved, I think we do envision that as having a huge amount of value,
Mhm.
because there's nothing like hearing from somebody who's in the thick of it, right? Who's in
Yeah.
the weeds on a given thing. And that's true not just for our other, subscribers, audience members, but for us as well, to really get that specific sense. So I think that gives us so much kind of fuel, and it sparks, good ideas, and it sparks questions, right, that we get to ask. And then, a big part of that, our excitement around it gets, oh, we've got something to answer, right? And we know there's going to be
Yeah.
value for the people listening to us because they're the ones raising the concerns. We're conducting our own
Mhm.
feedback and listening sessions. We're not
Yeah.
really judo
Yeah.
throwing resistance, but we are taking that feedback and really trying to turn it into something that works for, the audience that we're really trying to serve. So
Yeah.
I agree. That's
And I think
exciting all around.
I think to me, it feels like a flywheel, right? And like on two sides of the flywheel, we're on one side with our research and discussions on LinkedIn and all the other research in the podcast. We're reviewing practitioners, and we're pushing up on one side, and the community is going to be pushing down on the other side. And it's just going to build momentum. And yeah, I'm really, really excited about it.
Yeah, ready to learn a lot. I talk all the time on here about how, I feel like my job is mostly learning about these new things, and this is definitely, a pathway to doing that. And we can kind of close out on I think, a related topic. We've learned a little bit about, you mentioned systems engineering earlier, and systems thinking is its own kind of way of operating. Systems engineering is its own way of doing things. For people who are, in that world of systems engineering, we've asked about struggles, and tried to learn about what are kind of the challenges that people run into, and the lack of, well, or maybe the level of training around
Mhm.
systems engineering, the learning curve associated with it, is near the top of that list. So talk a little bit about why
Yeah.
that matters, right? What strikes you as important about, kind of learning that when it comes to systems engineering, it's the getting up to speed, right, that often presents a pretty big hurdle.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's fascinating about this, I had a convergence of three things this week on this exact topic. So,
Um,
number one, someone on LinkedIn, I can't remember their name right now, but they they put out a post about SysML 2.0. And or no, maybe it was an INCOSE like body of knowledge around systems engineering and MBSE. And they shared that documentation was either 12 or 1,300 pages long. Yes. The takeaway there was that this is ridiculously complex, and this represents a challenge for adopting MBSE. And then yesterday, I interviewed Bradley Ramsey and Braden Ramsey, sorry. And we had a really good discussion all around systems engineering and MBSE. And he cited this issue that there's clearly value with systems engineering and MBSE, yet the learning curve, like the pitch on that is so steep that it's a real challenge that is not as present with other types of initiatives. They're just
mhm.
not as complex as MBSE. And then the third point, convergence of three, from the study that we conducted, I think we finished it back in December. And there were three parts, about change agents, MBSE, and MBD. And we're kind of doing our analysis and triage of findings of those progressively. So last week, you saw this, Josh, we had an internal review of the MBSE findings. And what we found is that, we asked what the challenges are. And we do this as an open field. You can type whatever you want because we don't want to introduce bias. If you present 3 options and people are thinking about a 5th, right? Well, there's nowhere to put it, right? You're artificially constraining the respondent. So open field, you can type in whatever you want. And then we use AI to analyze it and categorize the response. So what's interesting about that is both with generic change initiatives and with systems engineering, people were the biggest issue. We've pounded this drum for a while now. It was around 40% to 45%, but very well aligned between generic change initiatives and MBSE. But the second most frequently cited challenge around systems engineering was the learning curve and training. And I think it was high 20s. It was close to 30%. And I think that just speaks to the unique complexity of MBSE and that it is very powerful. It can provide you a lot of value, yet it also introduces significant challenges in terms of actually adopting and implementing it and deploying it and then making it part of your processes. So there was a convergence of those 3 things. And a 4th thing. Someone underneath SysML models, it uses SysML, which is a code language, basically. So you get a pretty diagram that you can interact with, but underneath that is software code. So you're building software code as you build an MBSE model. Now, as we talked about before, AI is really good at working with software code. You can vibe code with it and you can be incredibly productive. Got to check your work, right? Because it will hallucinate, but it's a great way to be more productive. And because SysML is a code language, I saw someone this week starting to experiment using AI with SysML and using it to automate the creation of a model. So that was really fascinating. And that could be a potential solution to address this complexity issue. So again, the interface layer AI might be a boon for this. So end rant. There is a convergence of topics that really got me going this week.
I was going to say I was waiting for a 5th to converge there in the middle, but no, I think and you're right. Looking ahead in February, I think we'll start to roll out some of our MBSE specific content around some of those findings. But I think that's what's interesting to me about that is we've talked a lot the past several weeks about change initiatives under kind of a big umbrella, right? This can be model-based definition, MBSE. It can be a whole range of initiatives that you might need to be executing. And so asking questions around resistance, obviously, depending on what initiatives a given organization is pursuing, those respondents are going to probably be speaking from that experience. And so, being able to divide up a little bit and say, okay, well, MBSE has its own specific hurdles, right? And the learning curve could be one of those things that doesn't really, impact other types of initiatives as much, because in that case, I don't really know how to use the technology that we're bringing on board to implement this is a different thing than, am I going to get fired because we're doing things differently now? Or is my job going to become redundant? Right. Those concerns are different. But if you, right, to get back to what we talked about earlier, if you are able to catalog and understand that as part of your own struggles, then you can be prepared for it. And so it'll be interesting, whatever the tools are, and AI you just talked about, that enable organizations to do some of that and address the specific concerns or types of resistance that might spring out when you are targeting MBSE as a specific initiative, because it has a level of complexity that, when you said 12 or 1300 pages, I feel a little bit of relief, because sometimes I feel like if we put out something that's 25 pages, I'm like, that's a little bit long. Is people going to really read that thing end to end? And then 1,200 pages. I'm pretty sure no one is reading that end to end, or at least not doing so enthusiastically. So, I think that makes perfect sense. And hopefully, going forward, as we dig further into these results, we're able to provide some specificity around, the impact not just of some of these activities that organizations can pursue on change initiatives in general, but really target those things down to what kind of initiative they're pursuing. And if there are
Yes.
specific pieces of guidance we can offer to make that a little bit easier, then great. I mean, I'll feel great about
Yeah.
making that 1,200 page problem feel a little bit smaller.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Um, so yeah, lots of good topics this week. It felt like AI was part of every single one of them, almost. Um,
I
But
think
that's
we're
the age
just
we're
looking
living
into a
in.
crystal ball. I see just our, I think I don't think that we're too far off the mark if our LinkedIn poll, small sample size though it was, is anything to go
Yeah.
by. There's certainly an amount of interest, and I think what's maybe kind of most prominent about that is there is interest. There's maybe not a whole lot of certainty. And so maybe that's driving some of that. Like,
Yeah.
I would just like to know, does anybody have a good idea about how to put this stuff into practice? And it sounds like from some of your LinkedIn conversations, there's movement in that direction, right? People are trying to get to a point where they can leverage some of that stuff. So yeah, I agree. February, like I said, a lot more MBSE stuff coming forward. And I look forward to being able to kind of deconstruct that more specifically and break down for those folks, especially knowing now the hurdle they face in the learning curve of putting something like that in practice to be able to provide some of that guidance. And so, yeah, looking forward to digging into that stuff and talking about it with you on here, which I'm sure we will do.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, Chad, thanks as always for the conversation, and I appreciate all of the learning you sent my way as we prepare for Snowpocalypse. Stay safe. Hopefully, the ice avoids both of us. And yeah, good talking to you, and we will catch you all next time.